The topic of this lecture is political entrepreneurship, and the first thing I want to do is to introduce the topic as a contrast between real market entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship. Two different things, and there is some literature in economics in the subdiscipline of public choice that talks about uses the word anyway, political entrepreneurship. But they don't use it always in the same way that I would, because they sort of try to model political entrepreneurs as similar to market entrepreneurs, real free market entrepreneurs, business people. And what I'm going to have to say is that there's a radical difference. In fact, it's just the inverse. As far as the implications for economic performance, it's just the opposite. A political entrepreneur is the very opposite of a market entrepreneur, even though every once in a while you could find some very transparent similarities. Like you might find the mayor of a city who is fed up with the bad quality water supply provided by the Public Works Department and contracts out to a private company and does something good. But that's the exception that proves the rule, that politicians generally are entrepreneurial in a very different way. And basically, a market entrepreneur, to succeed, basically has to cater to the consumer. The consumer is king. One of my favorite passages in Human Action by von Mises is in his chapter, Discussion of the Consumer, where he talks about us as consumers as hard-hearted and callous. He uses those words, hard-hearted and callous, meaning if you find a pair of sneakers that is marginally better than the one you've been buying for the past 5 years, you'll dump that brand and you'll take the new brand immediately, or if it's cheaper. And so, we'll drop that old company on a dime if we can save a few pennies, or if it's a very tiny difference in quality, and on a whim. And now another aspect of this is if you look at the behavior of political entrepreneurs versus market entrepreneurs, another good illustration of this that I've written about also in my research is the railroad industry in America. The very first large-scale funding in terms of corporate welfare of any kind of industry was the railroads in the 1860s. Okay, prior to that, there had been some state governments had subsidized the building of canals and railroads, but not much money. In fact, it was such a fiasco in the early 19th century that by the time you get to 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, every state in America had amended its constitution to make it illegal to use tax dollars for any corporation for any purpose, because it had been such a fiasco. But then that all changed during the Civil War when the federal government stepped in and started massively subsidizing railroad building and created the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads. And there was a nice contrast there, because a little later in the 1870s, there was a man named James J. Hill who was the founder of the Great Northern Railroad. And one of the characters in Atlas Shrugged is modeled after James J. Hill, the Ayn Rand novel. But he was the founder of the Great Northern, and you can read about him. The best place to read about him, there's a great book on political entrepreneurship by Burton Folsom. It's called The Myth of the Robber Barons. And there's a chapter on James J. Hill. And this is a real stark contrast between Hill and who was a real market entrepreneur, and the political entrepreneurs who ran the government-subsidized railroads. And basically, I'll draw you a map here. You know, I drew a map of the United States for you here to show you what was going on at the time. Here's America, right there, and here's Council Bluffs, Iowa. This was the eastern terminus of the government-subsidized railroad, and it is also where, in 1857, Abraham Lincoln invested in real estate. And then when he signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, the act gave him the authority to decide where the eastern terminus was. And by sheer coincidence, I'm sure, Honest Abe chose Council Bluffs, Iowa. And so that's where the railroad started. And so the objective, of course, is to go to the West Coast. They wanted a railroad so that all of the commerce from the east could go west and vice versa, travel both ways, and the population could go out. They wanted to populate the American West. And so they started building railroads, and the government-subsidized railroads took this kind of a route to the West Coast, something like that. And the reason for that was, since Congress was funding it, every member of Congress, even representatives of the territories that were not yet states, but who were there in Congress and who were going to have political power as soon as New Mexico became a state, for example, they had some influence too. And so every member of Congress from that area said, well, you'll have my vote for the subsidy, but you have to run a line to my city, in my area, whether it's economical to do that or not. And so there were appendages everywhere to all these places because that's how politics works. And so the political entrepreneurs that ran the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, the government railroads, pretty much built the railroad lines like this, very, very inefficiently. And I could read to you some of the examples of this that Burton Folsom talks about. Let's see. Yeah, so they really did build. Burton Folsom says they built winding, circuitous routes to collect for more mileage. Well, the subsidies were per mile subsidies, and so if you built it like this to go to California, it was more profitable. Whereas for James J. Hill, let's see, I'll draw another map. Here's another map of America. I'll call this the Hill map. There's Florida. There's Texas. Okay. James J. Hill's route was pretty much like that because he was a businessman. He wasn't a political hack. He was a businessman. And the only way he could make money was to find the most direct route, the cheapest route, to use the best materials for his rails, and so forth. And that's what he did. And so Hill became legendary. His autobiography is called Highways of Progress. If you want to read a really interesting biography by a really hardcore free trade enterpriser of the 19th century, I would recommend that one. He brags in the biography that he never accepted a dime in government aid of any kind. He didn't accept land grants. Unlike the government railroads, if he came across Indian lands, he did not call in the army to murder all the Indians. He bartered with them with livestock or money or whatever they could trade for rights of way across their land. But it was the government subsidized railroad that socialized the cost of building railroads. And part of the way of socializing the cost, that is forcing the taxpayers ultimately to pay the cost of building the railroads, was instead of paying the Indians something, they would just kill them all. In fact, the chief engineer of the government railroads was a man named Grenville Dodge, who was a close friend and confidant of Abraham Lincoln's. And during the Civil War, Lincoln made Dodge a general, and his job was to kill Indians and make way for the railroads. So he spent his time in the war killing Indians. And then after the war, Grenville Dodge recommended to the government that they make slaves of the Indians and make the Indians dig the railroad beds from Iowa to California. The government chose not to do that. It chose to kill them instead. And so if you want to read about it, go to the Independent Review and read my article about it in the last fall issue of the Independent Review. It's on independent.org is the website, and you can find it. Just type my name in there. And so, but James J. Hill couldn't do that because he wasn't government subsidized. He competed with these people. He competed with them. And so I'll give you some example of political entrepreneurship that Burton Folsom writes about, of how it worked out. Now here's Grenville Dodge, the chief engineer of the railroad. So he's a big guy. He's the chief engineer of the government's transcontinental railroads, of which many books have been written. He says, since Dodge was in a hurry, he laid track on the ice and snow. Naturally, the line had to be rebuilt in the spring. So here they are in the Rocky Mountains, and there's 10 feet of ice pack, and they get people to build railroad tracks on top of the ice pack. Then when the spring thaw comes, it collapses, but they make double the money. They got to build it again, so they make double the money. It's government, like, dig a hole and fill it up again, dig a hole and fill it up again. That's, it was the original public works project. And he goes on to say, what was worse, unanticipated spring flooding along the lower fork. Who would unanticipate spring flooding in the Rocky Mountains? Of the Platte River, washed out rails, bridges, and telephone poles, doing at least $50,000 damage in the first year. No wonder some observers estimated the actual building cost at almost 3 times what it should have been. Okay, and he goes on to say, the subsidized railroads routinely use more gunpowder blasting their way through the mountains and forests on a single day than was used during the entire Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. So if you can imagine that, they just blasted their way through the mountains, through the Rocky Mountains. And here's another classic example of political entrepreneurship. One of the real robber barons, I mean, there were real robber barons. It was these guys. It was Grenville Dodge and another man named Thomas Durant who ran this. They were the political entrepreneurs. James J. Hill was not a robber baron. He didn't rob anybody. He was a market entrepreneur. And here's another passage from Folsom about the Union Pacific. In 1866, Thomas Durant wined and dined 150 prominent citizens, including senators and ambassador and government bureaucrats, along a complicated section of the railroad. He hired an orchestra, a caterer, 6 cooks, a magician, and then he has in parentheses, to pull subsidies out of a hat, question mark, and a photographer. For those with ecumenical palates, he served Chinese duck and Roman goose. The more adventurous were offered roast ox and antelope. All could have expensive wine, and for dessert, strawberries, peaches, and cherries. After dinner, some of the men hunted buffalo from their coaches. Durant hoped that all would go back to Washington inclined to repay the Union Pacific for its hospitality. So it was wining and dining and lobbying was the focus of these political entrepreneurs. And then if you read about what James J. Hill did, on the other hand, here's what Folsom says. Under his direction, the workers began laying rails twice as quickly as the Northern Pacific crews had, the other government-subsidized railroad. Hill passed on his cost reductions to his customers in the form of lower rates because he knew that farmers, miners, timber interests, and others who used his railroad services would succeed or fail along with him. His motto was, we have got to prosper with you, or we have got to be poor with you. So he understood that the farmers and timber interests and anybody who lived out there and worked out there, they had to prosper. He gave the farmers free seed, grain, and even cattle. He had contests for raising the biggest cows and things like that to encourage farmers. And he dropped his rates steadily. Burton Folsom writes that James J. Hill, quote, gloried in the role of rate slasher and disruptor of price-fixing pooling agreements. So here's the government-subsidized railroads conspiring to fix prices, and James J. Hill comes along and enjoyed the heck out of dropping prices and foiling the attempt to fix prices. One more quote about James J. Hill from Burton Folsom. He says, Hill's quest for short routes, low grades, and few curvatures was an obsession. In 1889, Hill conquered the Rocky Mountains by finding the legendary Marias Pass. Lewis and Clark had described a low pass through the Rockies back in 1805, but later no one seemed to know whether it really existed or if it did, where it was. Hill wanted the best gradient so much that he hired a man to spend months searching western Montana for this legendary pass. He did in fact find it, and the ecstatic Hill shortened his route by almost 100 miles.